Okay, so hello everyone for the 10th session of the Nāgārjuna Mūlamajjhāmaka reading group. And for this meeting, we're going to go over chapter 16 and 17. Hopefully we can get through everything in time. 16 is an analysis of bondage and liberation, and 17 is analysis of action and fruit. So yeah, so the first page of chapter 16 basically starts by going over the sort of main emphasis on this chapter, of course. So it's basically is wondering about sort of what exactly is reborn in the process of rebirth, in the process of transmigrating through samsara. And I guess one of the main questions is, what is it that's actually reborn? And typically the two things that we consider are the or a composite phenomenon like the skandhas and samskaras, and or two, the person or the pudgala. And so we're going to go over all the different views and arguments against seeing either the samskaras or the pudgalas as sort of inherently existing things that transmigrate through the sequence of rebirth. So let's see. So verse 1, I'll just read that. If it is composite things that undergo rebirth, they are not reborn as permanent entities, nor as impermanent entities. If it is a living being that is reborn, the method of refutation is the same. So just a quick thing that I've noticed here on this chapter as kind of a pattern is like a lot of the things that we can analyze in terms of the samskaras, we can also pretty much analyze the same way to the pudgala. Which is, very repeated sort of pattern throughout the MMK, which is that a lot of sort of logical forms of analysis on any particular thing very much apply to a lot of things of the similar nature. So, yeah, so in this case, it seems like we can sort of treat the samskaras and the pudgala the same way, the different condition factors in the person. So we don't hold the view that the factors are reborn as permanent entities. And what I got from that is that a permanent entity doesn't function or change. And if something doesn't function and change, it doesn't make sense how it can actually play a role in the process of rebirth. Because in the process of rebirth, it's like, it's a process of transition and transmigration. So it doesn't make sense for something that's permanent to either be a condition for rebirth or being the one that's being reborn. And the more subtle critique here is the idea that they're impermanent entities. And the idea for this one is that when we really think about it in terms of true impermanence, moment by moment arising and perishing, the idea is that these entities are not reborn as impermanent either, because the moment that they arise is the same moment that they perish. So they perish before they can actually function and cause some subsequent result. So the idea that's implied here is that something has to endure for more than just a moment to actually be causally efficacious.
And this is the same argument that's made against just causality in general. Earlier in the text.
Oh, right, yeah.
Or it's one of the arguments, it's one of the 4 arguments that's made against causality in general earlier in the text, right? That a thing can't be a cause because it doesn't exist when its effect does, because it only exists for a moment, and the effect exists in a subsequent moment, so the effect doesn't need it to exist, so it wasn't the cause.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And just going to the flip side, it can be permanent because then the sort of cause is always there and never effectuating anything.
Yeah, or always producing its effect, but this is just not how we see that. Then there just wouldn't be change if this was how causality.
So verse 2, if it is said that it is the person that is reborn, it being investigated in the 5-fold manner with respect to the skandhas, ayatanas, and dhatus does not exist, who then will be reborn? So the text here refers us a little bit back to the chapter on fire and field, because we go over the same thing, this sort of five-fold way of understanding sort of how things can exist. And so in this case, translating it to not fire and fuel, but the person, one, we can consider the person has the intrinsic nature of the skandhas, which means that the person is identical with the psychophysical elements. The second view is that the person is distinct from them. The third view is that the person exists possessing the skandhas. The fourth view is the person is in the skandhas. And the fifth view is that the skandhas and so on exist in the person. And so the idea is that when we investigate these relations in all the five ways, we can't establish any of them as actually holding in any way. So I can like try to move through each one. So if the person is identical to the skandhas, then let's see. Okay, so actually before we go there, there's something that I think is important to recognize here, is that the skandhas and the person, you can never actually truly distinguish them from each other, because they're always come together. They're kind of almost defined in terms of each other. The person is that which is appropriating the skandhas, and the skandha is that which is appropriated by the person. In a way, you can say that both skandha and person are co-produced by each other. And one of the issues with all of these five different ways of outlining the relation is that they explicitly or just subtly sort of assume that there is a way to distinguish the person from the skandha in a meaningful way, which sort of counteracts their actual nature. So which is why none of them can be established. So let's see. So the person can't be, the person which is identical to the skandhas is not the one that's being reborn. Actually, I wrote in my notes, it's been a while, I wrote in my notes that the problem is that the person who is reborn from the skandhas, that would be superfluous. Now I'm forgetting why I wrote that.
Well, because I maybe this isn't why you wrote it, but like looking at the commentary to 3, there's this note about how if you imagined that you could have a person without the aggregates, well, then the person would seemingly be already liberated, because the aggregates are the thing that is, you know, dukkha, as according to the first truth, is the clinging aggregates. But also the aggregates themselves, if you could have aggregates without a person, what even are the aggregates doing then? They're just like,
Right.
Who is the one who's in need of liberation then? The person becomes superfluous because you just have aggregates that don't need to be liberated because they're not a person.
Right. Yeah.
Is that maybe?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. The sort of it's like the person that you're considering kind of already has the skandhas. So it's to say that the person comes from the skandhas, so it doesn't make sense. You're adding more than there actually has to be. So number 2, the person is distinct from the skandhas. Well, that doesn't make sense because like I just defined earlier, since the two components co-arise together, saying that one is different from the other assumes that they're sort of unrelated, that you can have one without the other. And that doesn't make sense. There's never a point at which you can point to a person without also referencing the skandhas, nor any point where you can reference skandhas without a person. So the relationship of distinctiveness can't hold. 3, the person exists possessing the skandhas. I think that is kind of like, I think the issue I got from that is that it's kind of redundant, because like the person is already the one who's possessing the skandhas. So you can't say that the person who's reborn is the person who's possessing the skandhas, because the person is already someone who possesses the skandhas. 4, the person is in the skandhas. And so the commentary sort of says, kind of with reference to the fire and fuel example, that with 4, the person is in the skandhas or the skandhas are in the person. That also sort of assumes that you can meaningfully distinguish the two. So it doesn't make sense for one to be in the other because they sort of come together already. So yeah, so the person can't exist in any of these ways. So we sort of left with the question, then what exactly is reborn? 3. So verse 3, being reborn from one appropriation, i.e. state of being, to another, it would be extinct. And being extinct and without appropriation, who is it that will be reborn to what? And part of what I got from what I read in the commentary is that the thing about the extinct is that going from one state of appropriation to another, if we say that it's the person that's moving, we almost have this kind of gap between the past life and the next life, where there's the person who's doing the appropriating, and then the next person who's reborn from that previous moment of appropriation. There's almost that gap where the previous life that involves appropriation is sort of done, and then you have the next step that comes after. But if it's sort of done or already extinct right before the next life occurs, then it sort of begs the question, is that like what's happening in that sort of that gap or that space? What do you think, Sagar?
Well,
I might have to look back at the commentary to.
yeah. So okay. So there's the. I actually think we already kind of covered this, talking about like imagining a person separable from the aggregates, or a person that isn't separable from the aggregates. Either way, if they are undergoing if the person's undergoing rebirth and they're being reborn from one set of skandhas to another, at the time when they lose one set of skandhas, why wouldn't they just be liberated at that point, if that's how appropriation works? But if that's not how it works, and actually, well, no, they still are suffering even without skandhas, then what even are the skandhas doing? It just seems like being a person is suffering, and being a person clinging to aggregates is just like an additional, right? It's like you said. And then the thing that is interesting then with verse 4 and 5 is that this doesn't just apply to bondage. The exact same argument can be asked when we ask the question, who is liberated from bondage?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's another problem I just thought of too when you mentioned it. It's like if there's a person is always with some set of skandhas in this process of rebirth, you don't want to sort of separate a person from the skandhas. One possible solution, which becomes an issue, is that like you almost have like the same person having two different sets of skandhas, and like sort of that doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, so like you said, with 4 and 5, the implications extended to not just bondage, but also liberation, not just samsara, but also nirvana. And I'll just read that. For the nirvana of composite things is not in any way possible, nor is the nirvana of a living being in any way possible. 5, the composite things whose nature it is to come to be and pass away are neither bound nor liberated. As before, a living being is neither bound nor liberated. And I thought the explanation of the commentary was helpful here. Neither bondage nor liberation can pertain to the composite elements because their transitory nature means that they do not abide in any state or condition. So that's pretty interesting. The living being or person is neither bound nor liberated because it is not to be found in any of the 5 ways it might be related to the composite elements. So then 6, if binding means appropriating, then what has appropriation is not bound. Something without appropriation is not bound. Then in what state is one bound? And the commentary says, it cannot be something that has appropriation as its nature. Actually, let me go back a little earlier.
This is kind of similar to the fire and fuel thing.
Yeah.
Right? because if bondage occurs because of appropriation, then of the thing that's doing the appropriation, we can either say if it's of a nature to be unbound, then it's not going to get bound by doing appropriating because it would just already be liberated. But it also can't be of a nature to be bound because then what's the appropriation doing? That's what we just said is the thing that's involved in bondage. And so like with the fire and fuel case, I think what this is pointing out is that believing that something like bondage occurs because of a coming together of conditions, a coming together of separate conditions, or believing that it occurs in virtue of inseparable but non-identical conditions. Both of these cases, which are involved in causal stories of bondage, don't work.
Yeah, and sort of just to echo what you said, and with the commentary echoes what you said, it cannot be something that has appropriation as its nature, for such a thing has already been bound and so cannot be bound again, but neither can it be something that is without appropriation, for such a thing is by nature unbound, like Gen 9.1. And verse 7, like a typical analysis to employ is the 3 times argument. 7, if there are binding prior to what is being bound, then it would assuredly bind what is to be bound. But then that does not exist. The rest of the argument is to be understood in terms of what was said with the presently being traversed, the traversed, and the not yet traversed. So Buddha Pilita kind of outlines how you frame this in terms of bondage. The already bound is not bound. The not yet bound is not bound. The presently being bound that is distinct from the already bound, and the not yet bound is not bound. And I think we went over the 3 times multiple times before, so I think the same sort of logic, of course, applies.
I think here the force of the argument hits much more than in the example with the traversed, the presently traversed, the already traversed, and the to be traversed. There, you could have said, when that example was first taught to me, it was the example of walking on a beach, and it was like the beach can't be characterized as the traversed or the presently being traversed or the to be traversed. And at the end of this, I was like, okay, but why does that matter? Because even if you can't coherently ascribe that to it, you could still ascribe lots of other things to it. It's a beach, there's sand there, there's whatever. I didn't really get what the force of this argument was, but then applying it to bondage and Buddha Palita's clear thing, the implication of saying, unlike with the case of being unable to say that something is traversed over as being intrinsically a quality of it, the implication of saying of something that you can't find a way to ascribe bondage to it for a Buddhist is a much bigger, or I guess more important conclusion. And it functions in the same way as the argument from motion, but it seems more powerful, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. It's more immediately connected to a principal concern of the Buddhist path. It is not, on the one hand, the bound that is liberated, nor indeed is the not yet bound liberated. If the bound were undergoing liberation, there would be simultaneous binding and liberation. And it seems like part of the issue with this is that you kind of have this contradictory state of something being bound and liberated, or not bound and not liberated, which sort of doesn't sort of make sense. Let me see if the commentary says something about that. Okay, yeah, so Buddha Pilita sort of admits that, conventionally as a manner of speaking, we can kind of say that something is and is not something at the same time. But, in this analysis, we're analyzing things in terms of their ultimate existence. We can't take this colloquial way of speaking and sort of use it to sort of justify ultimately existing things. So at best, that account is conventional, but not ultimate, which is what we're principally concerned with here. So the subject of this, so the commentary says, so the subject of this process of undergoing liberation is something with parts, and so does a mere conceptual fiction, not something ultimately real. What is ultimately real is without parts, hence it would have to be either bound or liberated. So 9. So 9 is cool, sort of talks about the paradox of liberation. Being without appropriation, I shall, so there's a quote here, air quotes, being without appropriation, I shall be released, nirvana will be mine. And so referring to that quote, for those who grasp things in this way, there is a great grasping of appropriation. So yeah, it's the sort of basic paradox of liberation that everyone talks about. How can you desire to go beyond desire if that itself is like a desire? So I guess it's just pointed out here to just emphasize, I guess that the import of this, of stating this paradox, I guess, is kind of to sort of downplay the extent to which there is appropriation. So you can't really forcefully desire to be beyond appropriation, because understanding that it's not, that appropriation doesn't ultimately exist. You can operate with it in a conventional sense, that like, in a manner of speaking, we can say that we're bound and we want to become unbound, but we don't have the kind of the weighty investment on the concept if we were to endow with intrinsic existence. So it seems like this is one interesting way of avoiding the paradox of liberation. Typically, it seems like one way to think about how to avoid that is sort of just say, okay, like it's fine because you within the path at some point the desire to be beyond samsara, is effective, but eventually you get to a point where you advanced enough where you don't need that kind of motivating desire anymore. So you sort of get rid of the paradox. Here it's kind of saying
desire, because that's the desire formulation of the paradox, but this is the identity formulation of the paradox.
Well,
as the commentary says, in terms of the notion that when one has the thought, I shall be released, one is identifying with appropriating the skandhas, which is just what causes bondage.
Right.
There's one sutra where the Buddha says that an enlightened one, when they use the word I, they use it just in accordance with worldly convention, but they don't have asmi mana, the conceit I am. Asmi is I am, and that mana is conceit. They don't have the conceit I am, but they say I am blah 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 in accordance with worldly talk. And so it's kind of interesting then that you might even say then, well, then this means that enlightened ones don't even have, even though they say, because that accords with worldly convention for how to speak about such persons, oh, I am an enlightened one, I am a Buddha, hence here is my teaching, know me as a Buddha. They actually don't have awareness of themselves being Buddhas. They don't have self-conceit. And similarly, I guess maybe the point would be with respect to number 9 here, they presumably also would not have awareness that they used to be ordinary sentient beings. Saying I was a sentient being and now I am a Buddha. Both of these would be alien to being truly, both of these thoughts would be alien to being truly lacking self-conceit. But then the implication is that the wisest possible being doesn't recognize that they were ever a sentient being. So why are we recognizing that we are sentient beings? Why are we saying, oh, I'm bound, I'm going to become liberated, and right now I am bound? When the ones who we think are liberated wouldn't even have that conceit in the reverse formulation, oh, I was bound, but now I am liberated. Because it's the same things either way that are being ascribed. If we think that they wouldn't have that conceit, why are we having the conceit?
Yeah, a lot of this sort of stuff makes me think that like the Buddha is like the ultimate post-ironic comic. It's just like, just because especially when I think about, I'm not sure, it must be a sutra or a sutta, but I never found it once I like actually encountered the story. You might actually know it, but this idea that when the Buddha, right after his awakening, his like disciples sort of like, before he was even awakened, his disciples sort of like left him because he was like breaking his asceticism. And so he gets enlightenment and he's like sort of walking to go to the next city, and he sees some random traveler. And the traveler is like, "Oh, who are you, dude?" And then the Buddha is like, "I am an enlightened person." Like,
Dona Sutta, yeah, I do know this.
Okay, yeah. And just bombastically just being like, "I am an awakened one, like light of the world, blah, blah, blah."
Yeah,
But
exactly.
all of that is ironic. Like, he doesn't mean to say what he's saying, but at the same time, he's so utterly bombastic about it too.
It's kind of bombastic.
It's just really funny.
Because the way Dona says it is, "Are you a god?" And he says, "I'm not." Like, "Are you a deva?" That is, and he says, "I'm not a deva." And he says, "Well, are you a nature spirit?" "I'm not a nature spirit." "Are you a like whatever?" He goes to his, "Are you a human?" He says, "No, I'm not a human either." And then Dona's like, "What are you then?" He's like, "I am a Buddha." That's what I am.
But the funny thing too, if I remember correctly, the sutta ends with the guy being like, "All right, dude," and just like walks away.
Yeah, and
Is
what's
that
funny,
true? Yeah.
so in the sutta, it doesn't end with describing what Dona actually does at the end, but Dona, it is known that Dona did eventually become a Buddhist, because actually he was one of the people who was entrusted with some of the Buddha's relics at the end after Parinirvana. Yeah, he was the first person to meet the enlightened Buddha, and also was there at the funeral and took some of the relics, which is interesting.
And if I remember the way the story was recounted to me, it also seems interesting. Like the first real skeptic of the Buddha was also like one of his last moments, like devotees too, which is super cool.
So I think what I want to check quickly is because I want to see if it's translated, is if the parallel of Dona Sutta in the Samyutta Agama, is this translated? No, it's not. Sad. Okay, is this? No, they're not. Okay, never mind. Because I've heard, just because in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of this sutta, in the footnotes, he mentions this, that the version in the Agamas is slightly different. One of the main differences is like an interesting quirk of language, where in the Agama version, Dona just asks him, are you a god? Are you a nature spirit? Are you a human? And he says, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not. No, I'm not." But in the Pali version, Dona goes, "Might you be a god?" And he's like, "I might not be." But that's not literally what he says. He uses the future tense, "Will you be a god?" And the Buddha says, "I will not be." But apparently in Pali, the future tense is used as like a subjunctive, like a "might you be" type thing. So in the Agama version, apparently Dona just asks, "Are you a god?" He's like, "I'm not a god." But in the Pali version, he's like, "Might you be a god?" And I was like, "I might not be."
I kind of like that better. There's more of the humor element to it there.
Yeah, there's humor to it.
And what you just said about the sort of answer and response sort of pattern there, we were sort of talking before this about the sort of view of the Buddha as kind of like this like perfect but mindless like machine that like does everything that a sentient being needs to do. It's like a lot of, I know it's also just for like, is it, is memory like, is it mnemonic devices that help you remember things? Yeah. So I know like a lot of sutras are structured like that, like repetitive and rote, so that you can like, so they're like mnemonic devices to help you memorize. But even then, it sort of helps sort of illustrate that sort of robotic view. We're just like, "No, I am not a god. No, I am not a human," kind of thing.
Yeah. Interesting. That would be very interesting if rather than just being a literary device, the Buddha actually talked like that, because that's a constraint of the Buddha's perfect according of his teaching to the needs of every sentient being, is that just naturally, just probabilistically ends up making it so that most of the teachings get given in a question and answer format.
Yeah.
So the Buddha actually in general talked like
No, I actually love that, because it's almost like as if like, his teachings were so perfect. We didn't even have to transcribe them in this like, in these mnemonic devices. They're kind of already emerged like that.
they're already like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another, I think the first time when I was first like going through certain sutras, when I started studying Buddhism, the Vacchagotta Sutra, when sort of Vacha sort of goes through all the various like sort of
Tetralemma for
yeah, tetralemmas, and there's also like there's this other term, not apparayas. I think there's a term that's used for when Kant goes over some of the similar ones. There's sort of these.
Oh, apparetic questions. Yeah, I guess
yeah.
Apparatic. But I think from a Madhyamika perspective, you would say, well, they're not really truly apparatic. The reason why the Buddha refuses to take a stance on any of them is because they all contain the mistaken presupposition of svabhava, which is why he doesn't take existence or non-existence.
Right. So not truly apparatic. But what I was getting to is that I remember first like reading it, and it's like the Buddha is just like with every question, he's like, does not apply, does not apply, does not apply. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. That's
really funny that you would say that, because I actually feel like Vacchagotta is one of the least robotic ones, personally, because I think it's beautiful. I think it's amazing.
It is really nice, yeah.
Specifically when Vacchagotta asks, when Vacchagotta asks, like, well, you said a liberated one, that like a person who's liberated in the fashion that you are, like when a person who's released in the fashion that you are, when they like, where are they reborn? And the Buddha says, reborn doesn't apply. And then he says, are they not reborn? It says, not reborn, doesn't apply. He does the robotic thing, I guess. But then after that, there's this really beautiful part where Vacchagotta is so confused. He's like, I'm so confused. And the little bit of clarity that I got from the earlier conversation, where you refused to answer my questions because you said that they were just a thicket of views that lead to suffering. Now I feel like I'm losing even that clarity, because now, instead of telling me, oh, stop asking these questions, you're a thicket of views, this isn't said, but presumably, now you're just straight up saying, it doesn't apply. And then the Buddha says, of course you're confused. Of course you're confused. Deep is this thing, hard to see, hard to realize, tranquil, refined, beyond the scope of reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise. And I've always thought that's very interesting. He's basically saying the nature of a Buddha is this very difficult thing to pin down.
Yeah. And
I've always felt like that's something that accords very much with a Madhyamika interpretation of this sutra.
The Buddha is like the perfect chatbot. Like it's
oh my gosh.
Right. But yeah, we can go on all day about that. Yeah. But just to conclude this chapter with the last verse, where nirvana is not reified nor samsara rejected, what samsara is there, what nirvana is falsely imagined. And so basically, that what the sense I get with this is that we can't take these two terms as terms literally as describing intrinsically existent states, because that would entail reifying either of them. At best, they're conventional points by which we can order our conduct, but beyond that, beyond manners of speaking about our experience, they're not actual intrinsically existing things. And that should be the sort of conclusion we got from this whole analysis on bondage and liberation. Let's see if the commentary has any better way to word this. Yeah, so the suggested conclusion is that we cease attempting to conceptualize the two and no longer take up attitudes of desire and aversion respectively toward them. But this is ambiguous. It might be taken to mean that while samsara and nirvana are ultimately real, their nature is ungraspable. Or it might mean that the very idea of ultimately real things is incoherent. Nāgārjuna will have more to say on this question in 25. So I think 25 is the analysis on nirvana, right? Yeah, it is. So we'll get a deeper look into that towards the end. Cool. And yeah, so we can move on now to 17, an analysis of action and fruit. So I'll read the small intro and the actual commentary. This chapter examines the relation between an action, karma, and its consequence or fruit, phala. The relation specified by what are now commonly called the laws of karma. Note the word karma is being used quite differently here than in chapter 8. There was used in the grammarian's sense of the object or goal of action, whereas here it means the action itself. The first 5 verses lay out the common understanding of the relation between action and fruit shared by the several schools. In verse 6, the question is raised concerning how this is compatible with the doctrine of impermanence. And the following 13 verses give solutions proposed by different schools. And then later, Nāgārjuna will subject these to his own critical examination. So in my outline, I kind of sort of grouped the verses into these 3 categories. You kind of have from verse 1 to 11, you have this sort of laying out of the orthodox view and the sort of the problem mentioned here about like how can this be compatible with impermanence. So there's the seed hypothesis that is put forth to explain how the orthodox view is compatible with impermanence. And then with verse 12 to 20, we have what I'm calling in my notes a nuanced objection. So a sort of more nuanced view that sort of rejects the seed hypothesis for certain problems and puts forth another hypothesis, that of the what's called the unperishing, or the commentary sort of refers to as like a karmic debt sort of view. And then from verse 21 to 33, we'll have Nāgārjuna's refutation of the nuanced view. Okay, so, and I don't think I'm going to go through every single one of these verses one by one, because a lot of it is basically just listing out the basic views on what karma is and all the different kinds of action, manifest and unmanifest, etc. So I'll try to skip to the sort of the meat of the arguments, particularly to lead to Nāgārjuna's analysis. I think we're a little bit more concerned with that.
Maybe skip verses 1 through 5 then?
Yeah. So I'll just sort of talk about that a little bit. And this sort of just goes over how karma involves this sort of twofold aspect of action. There's volition and that what follows the volition. And it seems like this sort of and so even though karma is typically translated as action, it's really that sort of intention behind the action that really determines the nature of the karmic consequence. So it's the intention to do good or to do bad that sort of unfolds a karmic series of causal events leading to a fruit that is,
this is a very familiar Sautrantika view. This is the view that is explained in very, very great detail, for example, by Vasubandhu in his Karma Siddhi Prakarana exposition on how karma is established. It gives the exact same metaphors. And I mean, Nāgārjuna explains it very well, though, but it seems like clearly Vasubandhu didn't invent the idea. It must have been circulating in Buddhism for centuries before, because Nāgārjuna presents the exact same idea, which is something I thought was interesting, because I thought that this idea was pretty closely associated with Vasubandhu, or even with just like Vasubandhu's time period, maybe. But I guess not, if Nāgārjuna knew about it in order to be refuting it.
the sense I've gotten from Malcolm actually in some of his like Abhidharma courses is that apparently a lot of times people can get confused about what Vasubandhu's actual views are, because a lot of his work sort of is about outlining and giving presentations on the Sarvasivadin view, not necessarily presenting his own view, but sort of giving an overview of these other people's views. So
Yeah.
It could make sense to me why we might get a really good elaboration by Vasubandhu, but only because there's sort of views already held by traditions that came before him.
Yeah.
So let's see. Yeah.
That whole Sautrantika thing is 7 through 10.
Yeah. So let's see. Just gonna skip some pages. Okay, so I'll start with 6 because this is where the sort of problem starts to occur. So the idea is that you perform an action and it gives rise to a consequent fruit that is like the action. So I think that's an important part of karma. Like equals like. You can't have a bad action producing a good result. You can't have a good action producing a bad result. It's always good and good, bad and bad. But there's also that time delay. So there's just like the action and then the fruit, the action and the consequence. What is it that mediates the two? So 6, if the action endures to the time of the maturation, then it would be permanent. If it is destroyed, then being destroyed, what fruit will it produce? So this is very reminiscent of what we were analyzing with the Putgalavadins in the process of rebirth. It's like whenever we're thinking in terms of permanence or impermanence, both of those two modes sort of get in the way of actual causal efficacy. So if the action is permanent, then it sort of like never actually gives rise to the fruit. It's just like always there. Or it just always gives rise to the fruit, and that's an issue. But if it's impermanent, then if the action is immediately destroyed afterwards, then like how does it actually give rise to a subsequent fruit? So the proposed solution here by the orthodox view is that there's a intermediary series of momentary events that emerge from the seed, from the initial action, that eventually give rise to the fruit. So the idea here then is that the seed is the ultimate cause of the fruit because it's the original basis that gives rise to the subsequent series that finally leads to the fruit. But the actual proximate cause, the one that actually immediately precedes the fruit, is sort of the last member of that series. So this seems to be a way of accounting for how can an action give rise to its consequence if there's a sort of gap in between. And so you fill this gap with a bunch of intermediary moments. And then let's see. Oh, and so this is illustrated with the metaphor of planting, sowing a seed, and then it turns to a sprout, which eventually gives rise to a fruit. The idea that there's these intermediary stages of growth that go from seed to fruit. And so likewise, just like the process of growing a seed into a fruit, the same thing applies to a mental series of actions, a sort of intention that gives rise to a series of mental moments that eventually manifest or unmanifest that leads to a particular karmic fruit. And let's see. So the nuanced view sort of starts to come in verse 12. So the nuanced view presents an objection. There are many gross errors on this hypothesis of yours. So this hypothesis of a seed-generated series does not hold. And so the explanation given in the commentary, which seems to be shared by Buddhapalita, Bhavavika, and Chanakirti, is that the difficulty being raised for the view just presented is that the example of a seed-fruit series is not sufficiently like the case of the action-fruit connection. For the seed of a mango will only produce a mango tree, never an oak. So that's interesting. So it's almost like a case where the analogy being used is sort of accidentally taken too literally. The sort of sowing of a seed and the actual planting of or the sowing of a seed that gives rise to a fruit, and the sort of relation between action as consequence is not entirely homologous. It doesn't actually apply, because according to the more nuanced view, there's sort of indeterminacy on exactly what kind of fruit results from a particular kind of action. Whereas we can trust that we plant a mango seed, we get a mango tree.
Yeah, I think that that's true, that they're attacking the analogy there, but I don't think they're just taking the analogy too literally. I think there is a way of framing the causal intermediary view of how karma works that would end up, like they are critiquing, obscuring or like precluding a view of complex karma, where a certain act can depending on different conditions, produce different effects. Because if you take a certain act to produce a karmic intermediary, then that series is sort of self-sustaining until the time for ripening. So what could cause its final ripening to be one way or another way? Under this view, you might wonder, well, aren't you just saying then that every single action will be guaranteed to produce whatever fruit is the natural result of its causal stream? And I think maybe that's what they're saying. Actually, they're saying, your picture does accord with the mango analogy, and that's why it's wrong, because your picture doesn't allow for the complexities of
Okay,
karma.
I see. Okay.
But I actually think there's a way that the Sautrantika could respond to this, which is to say, well, yes, it's true that the action, because it was the thing that initiated the causal series, it planted the seed, so to speak, is the ultimate cause of the ripening. That doesn't mean that the exact state of every single element in the causal series is exclusively determined by that initial planting of the seed. You can have then different subsequent conditions that basically modify what actually arises in virtue of that original, like basically modifies what intermediaries arise in virtue of the original thing, such that, say, as Bhaviveka, the same example Bhaviveka gives, something that initially might have caused rebirth in hell will just cause a headache because you do a bunch of good deeds that kind of like modify the ripening of that past effect. And I think the Sautrantika could respond in this way, but I don't think that the argument against the Sautrantika view that comes from this, from the people, in the view, whatever, in the next few verses, that's like what, 13 through.
Yeah, like 13 to 20.
13 through 20.
Yeah.
The 13 through 20, I don't think it just comes from taking the analogy too literally.
Okay.
I think it is a genuine problem with the Sautrantika view, potentially.
Yeah, no, actually, after hearing you, I think I did definitely so can get the problem inverted. It does seem like almost like the analogy is too good because it doesn't account for the more complex sort of processes that you just laid out. And the text doesn't really mention these, and maybe they're not actually problems, but I'm sort of thinking of a few problems already. It's almost, so like, for example, let's say there's an initial action that gives rise to a bunch of intermediary series that results in a fruit. Let's say, like, transversely, you have these other conditions that really modify the series to a particular outcome. If the modification is sufficiently strong enough, can you even say that the original action was the actual cause of that fruit?
Right, yeah, right? Why not say, well, actually the ultimate cause of that fruit was,
the other conditions, or the other actions that sort of intermixed with what ended up coming. So you almost sort of avoid, accounting for the first action.
Yeah.
And the other issue I'm thinking about too is that, well, couldn't we consider any one of the intermediary series as their own kind of fruit? And so,
well, I think that the answer is no, because that's not actually consciously experienced by the sentient being.
okay,
That's
yeah,
actually
right.
why. That's why.
So that's the more impersonal thing.
That's why Vasubandhu, no, it's still personal. It's just not consciously something you're consciously aware of. That's why Vasubandhu in Karma Siddhi Prakarana connects this explicitly to the view of the storehouse consciousness in Yogacara. He basically says the view of the storehouse consciousness is the best way to explain how this seed story works, because in Yogacara, the storehouse consciousness is conceived of as that consciousness that you have, but it's like subconscious. It's your mental processes, but you're not directly privy to them. And that's basically what these intermediary streams are. You're not actually privy to them, so it's not a ripening in your experience. You don't suffer directly as a result of the intermediary at the time the intermediary arises, because it's arising as like a subconscious mental process.
Okay, yeah, I think I was just confusing just a simple consequence or result with like a fruit. I guess like the intermediary series can just be what results as part of the process of getting to the fruit, but it's not the actual karmic fruit itself. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so we just
karmic debt picture.
Yeah, so that's really interesting.
I never heard of this before.
Yeah, I really like this actually. I read the Garfield version of this of the MMK before. I'm not sure if it really goes as much into depth as this does on the sort of economic analogy. It's actually funny. There's like I once saw or once read. It's been a while, and I want to actually pull it up again later. But I read an article on like the BuddhistDoor.net or something. It's like a Buddhist website, and it's an article sort of giving an analogy about like investing in your path to produce good karmic fruit. This conduces to the path. It kind of analogizes it to like the stock market, and investing in the stock market and choosing wisely and stuff like that.
Yeah,
it's really
exactly.
interesting.
So, you make the right investments and you get paid out. You make meritorious investments, you get paid karmic dividends, but you go into karmic debt and you're gonna have to pay it back with bad experiences. And it's the financial analogy is very funny.
Yeah, and I'm gonna get a little weird and maybe potentially spooky here, but it almost and it's just like a completely unprocessed intuition that I had for a while. It's like there's always that sort of question of where does wait, how am I trying to phrase it? Okay, I need some time to think about it, but something about how maybe there's something like a karmic basis to this process of capital accumulation before capitalism even emerged on like a karmic level. With sort of this process of accumulating merit and being able to, accrue merit on top of that. Okay, I'm gonna start. The more
17 and 18 are so interesting because of the way that if you keep it in line with the debt metaphor from 14 and 15, it's basically like at death, you have to take a debt consolidation loan.
Yeah.
Pay off all your karmic debts from this life, but now you're in a new karmic debt that's the equivalent of all of them. It's so financial, it's really funny.
Yeah. Well, shit, it's making me think, okay, now I know what it was. I haven't thought about this in a long time, so it's kind of jumbled in my mind, but the idea is almost like, what if we inverted sort of historical materialism, and it's not the sort of relation, the actual social relations between people that are creating these sort of superstructures, but how in the sort of the Indian subcontinent with the caste system, it's almost like the sort of karmic relationships is what produces a superstructure. So that's kind of interesting.
Have you read Aganya Sutta?
I don't think so.
Oh, you should read it. It's very interesting. In it, the Buddha explains the origin of the caste system, actually.
Interesting.
I think you should read
Oh
it.
no, I've heard that there is a sutra that goes over that, but I haven't actually read it. So.
Well, yeah, so basically the way it's described is that the caste system originated with the sort of like, there's the standard like Buddhist view of like cosmological view, where at the beginning of an eon, everyone is just sort of reborn as these like deity. Everyone that's reborn in the desire realm is reborn as these like deities of some sort, but then they decline in moral virtue and become more coarse until they're eventually reborn as humans. And he talks about how basically the like Kshatriya caste emerges because first property happens. It's ninth section, dividing the fields, where land ownership happens first, and then they make a Kshatriya caste. They make a Kshatriya caste to govern so as to prevent theft once property emerges. And then once that happens, some people decide to become religious mendicants because they're like, wow, we should set aside, like ever since we started having property, we started having stealing and blaming and lying and all this bad stuff. So let's just go and set aside all these things and live in huts and meditate. And that's where Brahmins come from. That's the Brahmin caste. And then after that, then like the Vaishya caste is just from people becoming householders and applying themselves to various jobs as division of labor expands. And then it just says then the remaining beings live by hunting and menial tasks, and that's where the Shudra caste comes from. So he kind of gives this interesting perspective of the historical origination of caste, or like how they originally originated as like social categories. He doesn't give an explanation of how the like notion that you were born into a certain caste comes from, because these original founders of these castes weren't born that way. Actually, he says the first Kshatriyas were elected, is what he says happens. Anyway, but yeah, you might find that interesting.
Yeah, that was not, everything I just said was a jumbled mess, but I definitely want to look into that a little bit more. Why follow MLM, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, when you can be a MBM, Madhyamaka Buddhist Marxist? Let's see. Okay. So the unperishing. So let's go into that. So 13, the nuanced objection. After they sort of put forth the initial objection, they say, I, however, shall here propose the following hypothesis that is suitable and that has been expanded by the Buddhas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and Shravakas. 14. The unperishing is like the pledge pen. The action is like the debt. It is fourfold with respect to sphere and is by nature indeterminate. So I'll read here in the commentary. By analogy, there is an unperishing that occurs following an action. It abides until such time as a fruit arises. And I guess this is analogized to, actually, let me just read the whole paragraph because it goes over the analogy. The unperishing is a dharma that is said to result from an action that does not immediately produce its karmic fruit. The analogy here is to the pen with which one pledges to repay a debt, and by extension to the written record of one's debt. While the action of incurring the debt by signing the pledge is in the past, the record remains as long as the debt has not been repaid, and it serves as the immediate cause of the repayment. So by analogy, there is an unperishing that occurs following action. It abides until such a time as the fruit arises. One may thus think of it as a sort of karmic debt. It is indeterminate in nature insofar as it is not in and of itself conducive to either pleasure or pain. Which is interesting, just like the sort of the debt itself doesn't actually like make you have to pay it or not, it more so indexes the fact that eventually you have to.
Yeah, specifically it indexes because then when at the end of your life, it gets consolidated with your other dets, your current standing debt determines how good your next life is.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like almost like they create a credit, like the karmic debt consolidator. After consolidating your debt, calculates a credit score, and then that determines how good your life is.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So I'm pretty sure at the beginning in the introduction, this is the view that the commentary ascribes to the Pudgalavada. Is that true? No, am I wrong with this?
Let's see.
Where did I feel like oh yeah. First presents the seed hypothesis that was later associated with the Sautrantic school, and then the view of the Pudgalavada. So this is a very interesting view, this debt view. And I guess it's a Pudgalavadin view, which is why I've never heard of it. Because, you know, all the Pudgalavadin sects were all they were all associated with the ordination lineages from the Samitiya Nikaya, and that's a completely extinct ordination lineage. And their philosophical teachings never made it outside of just that group of monastic lineages. So nobody espouses Pudgalavada. So that's probably why I've never heard of this debt view before. But it's quite an interesting thought.
Yeah, I don't know if it was Evan Thompson or someone, but I read someone complaining about how people just dismiss the Pudgalavadins as like, oh, the Buddhists who believe in self, they're done. You don't have to really look more into them.
Yeah, it's definitely a more complex set of schools.
Yeah, so it seems like they've been, you know, conveniently characterized for a lot of different interests. And
I mean, maybe that is true, but I don't know how we're gonna get around it because they're also all extinct. So there's, you know, they're not here to defend themselves from our mischaracterizing them.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's up to scholars like Evan Thompson to rediscover and reconstruct as much as they can. Let's see. So just part of that end of that paragraph, it's indeterminacy that reflects the complexity of the workings of karma, the complexity that the opponent used against the seeds hypothesis. So that's the sort of benefit of this view that the seed view doesn't have, which is accounting for that complexity. The indeterminacy between whether or not a particular action is actually going to produce the fruit that you think it's going to, or that you would expect. And then, so then I guess we can still kind of skip over some of it, because now it kind of just sort of elaborates a little bit on some of the mechanisms. You had mentioned that, like, you know, towards death, all of these different karmic debts are consolidated together to sort of, as a sort of maximal debt that sort of determines what your next birth is, the nature of your next birth. Let's see. Yes, let me just read from 183, the commentary that sort of goes over that a little bit. In the rebirth process, there's a kind of karmic debt consolidator for all past actions, whether karmically meritorious, demeritorious, or neutral. So while each of the many actions one performed in this life that have not yet borne their fruit are still present at the time of death, these are then expunged by the one unperishing that consolidates the respective efficacies and determines the nature of the new life. So the many unperishings may be said to cease, just as one's many old debts are repaid when one takes out a debt consolidation loan. But as this theory is warned in verse 16, this should not be thought of as a relinquishment of one's actions. So once you take out a debt consolidation loan, it's not like you're completely free from debt. You're free from all the obligations to all the individual debtors, but you still have to deal with the consequences of the mass of debt. Let's see. And just to sort of reiterate that, later on the commentary says, while the fruit of one's actions cannot be evaded, the unperishing can be destroyed. Maybe I'm just skipping ahead a little bit. Actually, I just figured I just mentioned that, because let's just skip right to Nāgārjuna's refutation. So oh, actually, no, right before we do that, just concluding this nuance, this Buddha view in verse 20, there's emptiness, but there's no annihilation. There's samsara, but there's no eternity. And the unperishing Dharma of action was taught by the Buddha. So the unperishing view not only is supposed to account for the complexity of karma, but it's not just an ad hoc rationalization. It actually accords with something that the Buddha actually taught. Let's see. Yeah, so now Nāgārjuna comes into the conversation with verse 21. Why isn't action not arisen? Because it is without intrinsic nature. And since it is unarisen, it does not perish. So that basically implies what he's saying is that an action is not arisen because you can't find it. Ultimately, so the commentary says, ultimately no action is to be found because all actions are empty or devoid of intrinsic nature. So I just want to point out, interestingly enough, that with verse 20, the commentary says that what the Buddha just said implies that they see that the that the action in the way that they sort of outline with regards to how it sort of plays out with the karmic debt theory, sort of seems to imply that the action is also empty in the sense that it's not permanent, it doesn't permanently abide, but it's not annihilated either. It sort of gets written into this sort of karmic debt situation. But then with 21, we have Nāgārjuna's view on how exactly action is empty. And I just bring this up because it seems like two different ways of understanding what like empty means. And then Nāgārjuna's is a lot stronger, which is that it's not just empty in the sense that it's not permanent or non-existent, but it's empty in the sense that it cannot be found at all. So I thought that was interesting. Nāgārjuna's theory of emptiness is a lot more forceful in that sense. And let's see. Okay, so Bhavavika and Chanakirti sort of point to a possible citation from a sutta of the Buddha saying, actions do not perish even after billions of cosmic epochs. The right set of conditions and the right time have been attained. They surely produce fruit from living things. So the idea is that, well, if actions don't exist, then like, why did the Buddha say this? And the commentary states that that to this, Nāgārjuna replies that action is said to not perish because ultimately no actions arise. Something that never occurred in the first place cannot be said to perish. The Buddha's claim about actions must be taken as a mere facon de parler, I don't know how to say it in French, and not as a description of the ultimate truth about action and fruit. So that I looked up a translation is manner of speaking, a way of speaking. So it's just a conventional way in which the Buddha is sort of presupposing how worldly beings sort of understand causal processes, and it's a way of speaking that's conducive to, proper conduct, but it's not actually describing things in any metaphysical or ultimate way. So it shouldn't be taken like that. 22. If the action were something with intrinsic nature, then it would doubtless be eternal, and the action would be undone, for the eternal is not something that is done. Yeah, so if an action intrinsically existed, then it would be eternally undone, but that doesn't make sense because an action has to be done in order for the next stage of the process to occur, which is to give rise to a fruit. Sagar, you just disappeared.
Sorry, I am here. I'm not.
I
falling into the background.
Let's see. Yeah, so Chanakirti explains that the action would be eternal if it had an intrinsic nature, because anything with intrinsic nature cannot undergo alteration of nature. It then follows that the action would never be done or performed. This is so because in order for the action to be done, it must alter from the state of being undone to the state of being done. But then eternity is unchangeless, so it cannot undergo this alteration. So in 23, if the action were not done by the agent, then there is the concern that there would be the result of what was not done by the agent, and there would follow the fault of incontinence. Let's see. Yeah, so with verse 22, if the action were intrinsically existent, if it had an intrinsic nature, it would be eternally undone. And if it were to be undone, then there would be no fruit. And one of the absurd consequences that kind of follows from this is that you could sort of that you can have fruits that result from previous actions that were not done by you, which sort of like doesn't make sense. Because only the receiver of the fruit is always the person who conducted the action that gives rise to the fruit. So it doesn't make sense for there to be a fruit without an actual action that was done to link to that particular fruit. But then to think a little bit more about this problem of incontinence. So the commentators say, so according to Chandrakirti, state of incontinence means that someone who has lived a faultless life of continent behavior might still reap the fruit of incontinence. According to other commentators, the absurd result is that someone who has lived a life of incontinence might reap the fruit of continence, so make progress towards nirvana. So I guess incontinence means like you sort of lose control of like what's happening to you, right?
Yeah, like the commentary gives the example, like there would be no connection between reaping and sowing.
Right, yeah.
Like in the meme.
Yeah, and so this is another interesting point in 24. Without doubt, this would contradict all worldly conduct, and it would not be correct to distinguish between those who have done the meritorious and those who have done wrong. And the commentary then says, if the fruit of an action could come from an undone action, then such worldly pursuits as farming and weaving would be undermined. And I like this because you don't even have to like point out the issue from like a dharmic point of view. It's like the view you're trying to put forth to make sense of dharma inadvertently makes like mundane things impossible, which is just like dumb. It doesn't make sense. And so we sort of have to be consistent that our views of causality, of karma and such are consistent throughout mundane and super mundane like affairs. Let's see. And then I think we can sort of go through some of the next verses faster. Actually, I don't even think we have to go to the verses per se, but basically, let's see, with 26, actually, before I go there, let's say, just go over 25. And that action has already ripened will produce the fruit yet again, and it follows from the action being determinate that is endowed with an intrinsic nature. So one of the other consequences of an action being endowed with an intrinsic nature is that because an intrinsic nature ensures that the thing that has an intrinsic nature will never perish, is always eternal, then that almost seems to imply either that an action is never done and can give rise to no karma, or that the action is perpetually forever done, which means that you can get endless fruit from that one action. So either of those ways of understanding doesn't make sense, flies at the face of just ordinary experience. So then from 26 to all the way to 30, you basically have this sort of outline of how all of the things that are involved in this process of karmic ripening are all equally unreal. So, so the opponent already takes for granted that the defilements are unreal because they're produced by a mistaken view on how things are. So defilements are unreal. So if the defilements are unreal, so are the actions that are co-present with the defilements are also unreal. And if defilement and action are unreal, so too is the body that's associated with them unreal. And if the defilements and the actions and the body is unreal, then the agent who is undergoing that process is also unreal. And I did want to point out that in 29, let's see. Actually, in 28, the interlocutor, I guess the Pudgavadan, the more nuanced view, sort of tries to refer to a sort of logical structure that the Buddha outlined about the agent, that is neither that the one who is enjoying, the reward or retribution of karma, is neither someone other than the agent nor someone identical with the agent. And Nāgārjuna's implication with this is sort of that the interlocutor sort of misinterprets what the Buddha actually meant here. The Buddha didn't mean to say that there is an agent and we sort of kind of can't know about it. This sort of the view according to the Madhyamaka would actually be that saying that the agent and enjoyer are neither identical nor different is actually to say that it doesn't exist inherently at all. It's not to say that it exists and then we kind of can't really know about it, but that we can't know about it because it doesn't actually exist. It can't actually be found. And then finally, with verse 30, if the defilements and the actions and the body associated in the agent undergoing the process is unreal, then so is the fruit unreal. So from beginning to end, all of these different processes are all equally unreal. And that makes me think about something important that I think about. I just think is important is that inherently existing things. So only non-inherently existing things can relate to non-inherently existing things. You can't actually have something that's not inherently existent relating with something inherently existent. There's sort of a like with like relationship here. The things that can go into relation with other things have to be of a similar nature. So you can't have an intrinsically existing thing sort of relating to non-intrinsically existing things. So I think that sort of follows and grounds this whole sort of series of objections to trying to posit any of the elements in this process as real, because if one of them is unreal, then all of them is unreal, because that's just how things work. The things of a similar nature, only things of a similar nature can relate to each other. Verses 31 to 33 sort of illustrates this a little bit by basically saying that, the one thing is a magical illusion. It doesn't come from something more real. It just comes from something that's another magical illusion. So you kind of have magical illusions all the way down kind of view. So I'll just read them because they're nice verses. 31 to 33. Just as a teacher, by his supernatural power, fabricates the magical being that in turn fabricates yet another magical being, so with regard to the agent, which has the form of a magical being and the action that is done by it, it is like the case where a second magical being is fabricated by a magical being. Defilements, actions, and bodies, agents and fruits are similar to a city of Gandharvas. They are like a mirage, a dream. Yeah, so I just want to read a little bit of the commentary because it sort of nicely wraps things up. The guiding image of these three verses is that of a Buddha endowed with supernatural powers that are used in teaching the Dharma. Among these powers is that of making the audience see a magician who then produces various magical illusions. These illusions are thus products of something that is itself a magical illusion. Applied to the subject matter of this chapter, the analogy gives the result that agent and enjoyer of fruit are mere appearances that merely appear to produce the apparent action and enjoy the apparent fruit respectively, and that all these appearances are useful for attaining the end of the Buddha's teaching, nirvana. And I guess we can kind of say that because a Buddha is what a Buddha is, with reference to what a sentient being needs, and that sentient being's cognition is erroneous to a certain extent, that the Buddha is also an illusion. So it's not like the Buddha is this real entity that has the power to give rise to magical illusions, which give rise to magical illusions. The Buddha is also a kind of illusory product of the mind. So yeah, I guess that's. Do you have any more comments on this chapter? Cool.
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
Well, so that's 16 and 17. So let's see. The next chapter, analysis of the self. So that'll be cool. That'll be interesting. And the analysis of time. So that's about 14 pages for 18, and then 19 is 25 pages. So I think we can do 2 chapters: analysis of self and analysis of time. It seems very manageable. So yeah, let's agree to that. 18 and 19 for next week, and yeah, enjoy your week, guys. Thanks for joining. It was a lovely conversation.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next week.
Bye.